Chapter 305, Domineering Steps 3. The patron continues to astound this humble monk in many ways. How can such a small talent be astonishing? But why are you sending me a voice transmission? It is to convey this humble monk's intentions. Your intentions, venerable monk? If it were this humble monk's personal opinion, I would like to keep the agreement regardless of what the patrons did outside. However, now that the imperial military officer has come here and the patron has taken him hostage, if we let you go, Shaolin may be put in a precarious position. Is it because of your standing? How could a monk who has renounced the world think of standing? The imperial officials will surely use this as a pretext to pressure the main temple. If the monks who have left the secular world continue to face secular pressure, how can they focus on cultivating the Buddhist path? At Muzong's voice transmission, Mok Jiangun looked at him with surprise. Unlike the precepts hall master Daediak, he seemed to have a deep Buddhist faith without any selfish motives. Then what do you want to do? Do you want us to sacrifice ourselves for the sake of the monks? How could this humble monk force such a thing? Then what? I simply wish to give you an opportunity, believing in the patron's martial prowess. Opportunity? At Mok Jiangun's question, Muzong opened his mouth instead of using voice transmission. When a conflict with the secular world occurs, Shaolin has overcome it with a simple yet long-standing tradition. A long-standing tradition? That's right. No matter how different our positions may be, it is difficult to completely ignore the agreement we made. Since Shaolin is also a disciple of Buddha and a martial artist who hones martial arts, we intend to compete based on the martial arts code. Listen, Arhat warrior monks. Deploy the 108 Arhats formation at once. Yes. As soon as that command was given, rumble rumble, the 108 warrior monks, including those who had already deployed the 18 Arhats formation, deployed a formation around Mok Jiangun with tremendous spirit. When the 108 Arhat warrior monks lined up and assumed their stances, their majesty was like witnessing an army of thousands. What was even more remarkable was that they had only formed a formation, yet their energy doubled and filled the entire hall. Impressive. This was all too clear in the eyes of Mok Jiangun, who had opened his ghost eyes. One by one, ordinary energies converged into a single entity called a formation, becoming so formidable. Therefore he couldn't help but admire it. At that moment, the expelled monk Jia Jiamzhong shouted in an angry voice. Master! No matter what, isn't this going too far? What do you mean by competing based on the martial arts code? Isn't the 108 Arhats formation Shaolin's strongest force? The reason Jia Jiamzhong was so agitated was simple. The 108 Arhats formation was Shaolin's most powerful formation designed to subdue multiple enemies or transcendent masters of the true Grandmaster level. It symbolized Shaolin, and among those who had officially faced it, no one had ever broken the 108 Arhats formation. Amit Ba. That's right. The 108 Arhats formation can indeed be considered Shaolin's strongest force. Master, this is... Shu. At that moment, Mok Jiangun raised his finger to his lips, gesturing Jia Jiamzhong to be quiet. Jia Jiamzhong frowned and closed his mouth mid-sentence. Has his master gone crazy? Isn't he afraid of being surrounded by the 108 Arhats formation? While he was puzzled, Mok Jiangun spoke, looking at Muzong, who was standing at a distance. If you say it's according to the martial arts code, do you mean we should compete? That's right. However, I'm not asking you to break it. If you're not asking me to break it, presenting the 108 Arhats formation, which can be considered Shaolin's strongest force, to the patron is to express our reverence for the patron's outstanding martial prowess. Is it reverence? Or is it for a definitive outcome? Mok Jiangun chuckled and said, well, let's say that's the case. So what do you want to do? If not to break it. In the past, after an unpleasant incident, Shaolin further enhanced the formation of the 108 Arhats, making it much more perfect than before. If you can endure this 108 Arhats formation for just a moment, Shaolin will consider it fate and comply, safely sending the patrons on their way. Of course, if it is not feasible with just the patron alone, you are welcome to join forces with your companions. One moment. However, if you cannot endure it for a moment, this humble monk will have to hand you over to the imperial palace as traitors, even if the patrons resent me. If we do this, will the military officer from the imperial palace believe that Shaolin is not harboring them? Phew, Phew. At Muzong's proposal, Commander Konghak, who was being held hostage by Mok Jiongun, reluctantly nodded his head as if agreeing. However, his inner thoughts were completely different. Isn't the 108 Arhats formation of Shaolin known for its undefeated record and Shaolin's strongest force? This was a well-known fact among all martial artists. As far as he knew, even the 6 Heavens and 8 Stars masters, who were considered the pinnacle of the current martial arts world, could not recklessly challenge Shaolin's 108 Arhats formation. It was literally one of Shaolin's legends. No matter how strong this damn bastard is, it's impossible to last a moment against Shaolin's 108 Arhats formation. He was confident about this. Precepts Hall Master Daediak's thoughts were no different from those of the guard commander. Although that outrageously arrogant patron's inner strength surpassed his own, the power of the 108 Arhats formation was on a different level. In the distant past, they had unofficially suffered a humiliating incident, but the perfection of the formation now was incomparable to that time. He talked as if he were being compassionate, but the master has given him an even more inescapable task. Ho ho ho. Daediak looked at Reverse Muscle Scripture Hall Grand Monk Muzong with a satisfied expression. On the other hand, Mok Jiongun's subordinates had grim expressions. Even if they were allowed to join forces and given a time limit of a moment, could they really withstand the 108 Arhats formation? No matter how strong Mok Jiongun's martial prowess had become, they lacked confidence in this particular task. At that moment, if we are to proceed with your proposal, I should return the hostage to you. Please take him. Smack. Mok Jiongun lifted Commander Konghak, whose neck he was grasping, and threw him towards Precepts Hall Master Daediak as if throwing an object. What? At his sudden action, Daediak inwardly clicked his tongue. Judging by the way he was flying, it seemed that he had deliberately infused inner strength into the throw. However, he couldn't show himself being pushed back like before, so he hurriedly spread out his soft palm technique to catch the flying Commander Konghak. The moment he caught him, crash. Ugh. Daediak's expression momentarily twisted in pain. It was a technique of the physical transmission scripture. He tried to disperse Commander Konghak's force, but instead that force penetrated and entered, nearly pushing him back again. Gulp. However, thanks to forcefully enduring it, blood rose to his throat as if he had suffered internal injuries. At this, Daediak glared at Mok Jiongun with anger-filled eyes. This bastard. Regardless of his reaction, Mok Jiongun shrugged his shoulders as if he didn't care at all and turned his head to speak to Muzong. But venerable monk, may I also make a proposal to you? No, to Shaolin? A proposal? No matter how I think about it, this seems to only consider Shaolin's convenience. Even if we are in a disadvantageous position. So you're saying you'll reject this humble monk's proposal? No. That's not it. Then what kind of proposal do you intend to make? It's nothing much. I want us to receive compensation for nearly falling to our deaths due to Shaolin's mistake. Honestly, an apology alone seems insufficient for a matter involving people's lives. Compensation? How do you mean compensation? I heard that Shaolin has a very precious spiritual medicine. I think it was called the Great Restoration Pill. At those words, the monks of Shaolin stirred. Of course, Mok Jiongun paid no heed to this and continued speaking. If we pass the master's proposal, how about giving each of us one as compensation for the harm done to me and my companions? At Mok Jiongun's words, Precepts Hall Master Daediak intervened with a fierce expression instead of Muzong. The young patron must not be in his right mind to make such a request when you should be grateful for even being given a chance. The spiritual medicine Mok Jiongun had just mentioned was made from Shaolin's secret method. It took a long time to make just one because the manufacturing method was so difficult, and the reason it was famous was that if an ordinary person took the Great Restoration Pill, they would live a long life without illness, and if a martial artist took it, they would gain a full cycle of inner strength. Therefore, even in the martial arts world, Shaolin's spiritual medicine, the Great Restoration Pill, was regarded as the supreme spiritual medicine. What's there to be in the right mind about? If Shaolin hadn't dropped us, this situation wouldn't have happened at all. So shouldn't you agree to even greater demands? Ha! The patron truly prefers punishment over. Enough. Muzong reprimanded Daediak. As Daediak closed his mouth, Muzong clasped his hands together and spoke to Mok Jiongun. Amit ba. Patron. I apologize to the patron, but the number of Great Restoration pills is not that many, and moreover, they can only be given out after being approved in a meeting presided over by the abbot. Are you refusing on the pretext of procedure? How could that be? However, I believe there is certainly some truth to the compensation the patron speaks of. So, even if not the Great Restoration pill, I think I can give you the small restoration pill within my authority. A master. At those words, not only Daedalus but even the Sutra Pavilion Grand Monk Gongjon, who was favorable to them, looked at Muzong in surprise. That was because the small restoration pill was also a spiritual medicine that Shaolin prided itself on. In the case of the Great Restoration pill, the manufacturing method was so complicated and time-consuming that Shaolin created a substitute spiritual medicine. That was none other than the small restoration pill. This small restoration pill was also a precious spiritual medicine that could grant 10 years' worth of inner strength with a single pill. Master, this is... Swish. As Gongjon tried to say that they should be cautious, Muzong shook his head with a resolute face. His thoughts remained unchanged. He had already broken his agreement to prevent external pressure by making an enemy of the imperial palace. At this point he had a strong desire to compensate them with something, and just then Mok Jiongun made this bold request, so he considered it a good opportunity. Of course, please keep in mind that this proposal stems from the patrons being able to endure the 108 Arhats formation for a moment. Alright. With this, it seems the balance has been somewhat restored. I will not accept the small restoration pill. At that moment someone intervened and shouted loudly. It was the expelled monk Jiajiamzhong. At this, Gongjon spoke in a gentle voice, indicating that it was all right. Amit Ba. Sudiakman. If you're worried about burdening Shaolin, you don't need to. No, master. Instead of that, I want to receive something else. Something else. If we endure the 108 Arhats formation for a moment, instead of the small restoration pill, please allow me to strike the Precepts Hall master over there with full force, just once, no more, no less. At his words, Precepts Hall master Daedalus was dumbfounded. He wondered what that expelled fellow would dare to demand, but he impudently asked to be allowed to hit him? It was so absurd that he was about to say something. How dare you? Ho ho ho. Even if he was expelled, there is something called old ties, so can't we grant Diakman's request to this extent? Sutra Pavilion Grand Monk Gongjon took the initiative. At this, Reverse Muscle Scripture Hall Grand Monk Muzong nodded with a faint smile. What was so difficult about allowing him to strike just once, not even the small restoration pill? Moreover, Precepts Hall Master Daedalus had a significant influence on that child becoming an expelled monk, so he could fully understand that level of venting. Now before we begin, bring an incense stick that lasts for a moment. Yes. At Muzong's command, some of the warrior monks who were not part of the 108 Arhats formation clasped their hands together and were about to go and fetch it. At that moment, Mok Jiongun waved his hand and spoke in a meaningful voice. Shaolin will have to erect a tombstone due to another misjudgment. What do you mean by? It was at that very moment. Mok Jiongun suddenly stomped his foot on the ground. Quang. Crackle crackle. At that instant, with a tremendous roar, the ground of Arhat Pavilion's plaza cracked, centered around Mok Jiongun, and the vibrations spread in all directions. Along with the vibration that shook the ground, the moment it reached the souls of the Arhat warrior monks who were surrounding him in the 108 Arhats formation, tremble tremble. They all convulsed as if they had been struck by a shock, and then, thud, thud, thud. Without exception, they simultaneously collapsed to the ground. Chapter 306, Domineering Steps 4. Boom. A single stomp. With that stomp, the ground cracked in all directions and the 108 Arhat warrior monks collapsed. Without exception, they all convulsed and lost consciousness. Faced with this sudden and unbelievable situation, everyone was dumbfounded and the plaza was instantly filled with silence. One of the legends symbolizing Shaolin was none other than the 108 Arhats formation. Who would have imagined that this perfect formation, known to have never been broken by anyone officially, would crumble so effortlessly? Hey, are my eyes deceiving me? Siap Chun muttered in disbelief, his mouth agape. However, even this didn't register in Mong Muyak's ears. Even without Siap Chun's words, this was a sight that was hard to believe even when witnessing it with one's own eyes. Is this a dream or reality? It was to the point where one might think they were seeing an illusion. The masked Ma Arihayan felt the same way. Having even directly sparred with Mok Jaeyoung, he found it even harder to believe. No matter how outstanding his natural talent was, how could a human become this strong at such a rapid pace? This was way too fast. Moreover, even if the 8 stars or the 6 heavens came, would it be possible to crumble the 108 Arhats formation with just a single stomp? It couldn't be asserted with absolute certainty, but it seemed unlikely. This was something that would not only shock those present here but also astound all martial artists if it were made known to them. The cracked ground of the plaza centered around Mok Jaeyoung and the 108 collapsed Arhat warrior monks. It was truly a spectacular sight. This is unbelievable. How can such a thing? The warrior monks were in an uproar as well. Some overconfident masters had challenged the 108 Arhats formation in the past to prove their martial prowess, but the result was always the same. It was to admit defeat and return. Yet a sight that even the warrior monks of Shaolin found hard to acknowledge had unfolded. The gazes of the stunned and bewildered warrior monks naturally turned towards the elders of Shaolin. How? The one with the most intense reaction was Precepts Hall Master Daediak, one of the 3 supreme monks of Shaolin. He was staring at Mok Jaeyoung as if he were in shock, unable to take his eyes off him. He had been confident that although Mok Jaeyoung's inner strength was stronger than his own, he would be able to hold out to some extent, but he would definitely fail to withstand the 108 Arhats formation and be defeated just like before. However, when the result turned out to be the complete opposite of his expectations, he was utterly confused. At that moment, Commander Konghak, who was beside him, opened his mouth with wide eyes. This is unbelievable. How can such a thing happen? Is this really the 108 Arhats formation? Could it be that the warrior monks are acting to let them go on Shaolin's behalf? Does it look like an act to you, military officer? If it's not an act, how can such a situation occur with a single stomp? I absolutely cannot believe it. Although his martial prowess was not that high, he was also a master who had reached the pinnacle of the peak realm. Even in the eyes of someone who had learned martial arts, this was utterly unbelievable. It was so absurd that it seemed more like a falsehood. Then suddenly Konghak's eyes met Mok Jaeyoung's. Gasp. In an instant, a chill ran down his spine and his legs went weak. Just by making eye contact, he could perceive that the gap between him and that monstrous fellow was beyond comparison, making it difficult to even approach him. Once gripped by such fear, it was not easy to shake off, so he had no choice but to avoid Mok Jaeyoung's gaze. Seeing his reaction, Mok Jaeyoung chuckled. Then Chong Ryong's voice rang in his ears. Mortal. When did you even comprehend such a thing? Chong Ryong, who had been with Mok Jaeyoung all day, couldn't help but be even more astonished. Being inside the wooden puppet, it was difficult to accurately discern the flow of energy, but the Arhat warrior monks convulsed and fainted from the vibration that traveled through the ground. Where did he learn such a bizarre technique? It's the 8 thought-shattering techniques. What? At Mok Jaeyoung's answer, Chong Ryong couldn't hide her surprise. She had been trying to decipher the 8 forms of the 8 thought-shattering techniques for a long time but had failed to fully solve them. Yet, did this fellow mortal comprehend a form that even she was unaware of? It's quite useful. Mok Jaeyoung thought, looking at the instep of his foot with which he had stomped. Even Mok Jaeyoung himself did not expect the newly comprehended form of suppression to have such power. He had realized this by observing the footprint in front of the wall contemplation cave and the flow of residual energy in its vicinity. It was a technique that subdued the opponent through shock and vibration. This technique also involved a kind of suggestion, but unlike the previous techniques of the 8 thought-shattering techniques, it consumed a large amount of true energy. To be precise, it consumed deathly energy, using nearly 1/3 of it in a single use. As a result, only about 2/3 of the deathly energy remained in his body. I can only use it once or twice. Despite the increase in deathly energy and demonic energy due to his enlightenment, it seemed difficult to use it multiple times with this level of consumption. Of course, its power was so outstanding that even this single use was enough to break the opponent's fighting spirit. At that moment someone finally spoke. It was none other than Reverse Muscle Scripture Hall Grand Monk Muzong. Patron. While most of those in the plaza had surprised and shocked expressions, Muzong had a rather serious look on his face. Yes. May I ask you one thing? Go ahead and ask. Does the patron have any connection with the old blood cult? Murmur, murmur. At his question, the monks of Shaolin stirred. Because of Muzong's words, the monks of Shaolin without exception recalled one thing. What flashed through their minds was none other than the tombstone in front of the wall contemplation cave. The anecdote about that footprint, called Shaolin's humiliation, was remembered by all the monks of Shaolin to reflect on that time. At that moment one of the monks spoke. The domineering steps. It must be the domineering steps. Domineering steps. At the mention of the domineering steps, the commotion spread even further. The domineering steps. It is said that with a single step or a single stride, one can dominate over everything. However, for the monks of Shaolin, these domineering steps were the unofficial but first ever humiliating step that broke the 108 Arhats formation hundreds of years ago. Oh! Sutra Pavilion Grand Monk Gongjon was dumbfounded. Hundreds of years ago, when the 108 Arhats formation was broken by a single military step, Shaolin had gritted their teeth and worked hard to enhance it. Everyone had been confident that the 108 Arhats formation would never be broken again. Yet the same humiliation from back then was being reenacted. It was too much of a coincidence. At that moment Mok Jiangun spoke. I have no connection with the old blood cult whatsoever. At Mok Jiangun's answer, Muzong's right eyebrow rose. Staring intently at Mok Jiangun, Muzong said. That can't be true. I really have no connection. No. You clearly said it yourself. What did I say? Didn't you say, Shaolin will have to erect a tombstone due to another misjudgment? Muzong had heard this clearly. That was why, the moment Mok Jiangun stomped his foot, he had watched with disbelief, and he could clearly witness that disbelief becoming a reality with his own two eyes. Because of this he could be certain. While there were people who knew that the erection of the tombstone was called Shaolin's humiliation, no one except the monks of Shaolin knew who had left the footprint and why it was left. Yet that patron clearly knew the reason. Therefore he must have reenacted that moment. Shrug. Mok Jiangun shrugged his shoulders and spoke. I only know that because that venerable monk over there told me about it on the way to the demon-subduing cave. Mok Jiangun pointed with his eyes at none other than Sutra Pavilion Grand Monk Gongjon. At this, Muzong frowned and looked at Gongjon. Then Gongjon clasped his hands together and bowed his head. Amit Ba. I apologize, master. I told the heavenly demon patron about the anecdote of the tombstone. Meanwhile, murmurs could be heard from here and there. Did he say heavenly demon? He definitely did. Heavenly demon? How can such an ominous... No, then does that mean he has a connection with that bloody demon? The master just said there was no connection at all. At their murmurs, Mok Jiangun's eyes narrowed. Bloody demon? Are they referring to the man with the demon mask who left that footprint? While he was puzzled, Reverse Muscle Scripture Hall Grand Monk Muzong asked Gongjon. Is that true? It is. However, as it was decided to keep it a secret, I did not reveal who left the footprint. At his answer, Muzong fiddled with the prayer beads he held in his left hand. He had thought that the patron might be related to that person when the humiliation from hundreds of years ago was reenacted. But if it wasn't true, how could the same situation occur? It was truly a bizarre occurrence. Thereupon Muzong, after being puzzled for a moment, asked, Patron, then, are you saying that you reenacted it solely based on hearing the anecdote from Gongjon? I wouldn't say I intended to, but should I say I saw it in my mind's eye? Did you just say mind's eye? Yes. In my mind's eye, I saw how the one who left that footprint broke the 108 Arhats formation. That demon mask was quite impressive. At Mok Jiangun's words, Muzong's eyes widened. When he first mentioned seeing it in his mind's eye, he thought it was because his martial prowess had become high and his senses had become keen. However, when Mok Jiangun mentioned the demon mask, he couldn't help but be surprised. Oh my! An exclamation involuntarily escaped his mouth. Muzong looked at Mok Jiangun with a genuinely astonished gaze. What a fearsome talent! How can he engage in such a profound mind's eye technique at such a young age? The mind's eye technique was something that could only be achieved when one's mental cultivation was deep. Even he, who had cultivated the Buddhist path for many years, could only enter the mind's eye state by looking at formulas or traces after turning 60. Yet for that patron who appeared to be in his mid-20s at most, To have reached this realm was truly astonishing. Perhaps it was a predestined answer. An unbelievable aptitude to reenact what he saw in his mind's eye. In a way, it could be said that it was a talent even more fearsome than the owner of the footprint that first brought humiliation to Shaolin. Thus, Muzong finally clasped his hands together, bowed his head and spoke to Mok Jiangun. Amit Ba. Patron, or should I say heavenly demon patron? At his question, Mok Jiangun silently nodded his head. Yes. The patron's stomp can indeed be called the domineering steps. Therefore, as an elder of Shaolin, Muzong swept his gaze over the surrounding monks. Then with a deep sigh he opened his mouth. I acknowledge the defeat of the 108 Arhats formation. His words acknowledging defeat divided the reactions. Mok Jiangun's subordinates were delighted and some even cheered. On the other hand, the warrior monks of Shaolin had dark expressions due to the second humiliating situation they had to face. How can such a thing? Some warrior monks thought that this incident might also need to be kept secret. However, contrary to their thoughts, this result would spread throughout the martial arts world faster than expected. It would be said that Shaolin's 108 Arhats formation had knelt before the heavenly demon's domineering steps. Chapter 307, Domineering Steps 5. Reverse Muscle Scripture Hall Grand Monk Muzong approached Mok Jiangun with a much more relaxed expression and spoke. Amit Ba. I am genuinely astonished that you accomplished something even more difficult than the given task with such ease, patron. The original task was to endure the 108 Arhats formation for a moment with his companions. However, Mok Jiangun single-handedly shattered it with a single stomp. Muzong's astonishment was sincere. I was fortunate. At such a young age, reaching that level of martial prowess could easily lead to arrogance, but to see that you also possess humility is truly admirable. At those words, Mok Jiangun smiled faintly. In fact, Mok Jiangun was not accustomed to feelings of arrogance or conceit. He simply acted according to the situation he desired to create. Moreover, there's no need to deliberately make enemies, mortal. Just because someone is weak doesn't mean they can't become an enemy, and just because they're weak doesn't mean they can't be annoying. Is that so? A speck of snow at the peak can roll down and cause an avalanche. Shaolin is no different from a spiritual pillar in the orthodox martial arts world. I think you'll understand what I mean by just saying this much. It was also because of Chong Ryong's advice. Mok Jiangun, who deemed this reasonable, was gradually learning not to provoke the other party if it wasn't necessary. Of course, being monks who cultivated the Buddhist path, most of the monks of Shaolin did not raise objections or hold grudges over what had already ended. They cleanly accepted the result. The agreement is the agreement. Along with the monsters you brought. Is it alright if I also take Aliu over there? Aliu. I'm referring to the diabolic beast that was imprisoned in Shaolin's demon-subduing cave. Amit Ba. It seems you heard the name from the monster. Yes. In order to control that monster, I unintentionally made it my spirit beast. Spirit beast. It's a demon-taming technique. Yes. Monks who cultivated the Buddhist path considered demon-taming techniques that went against the natural order to be unreasonable, so Muzong also did not view it favorably. However, not wanting to get involved with them in a negative way any further. Amit Ba. Very well. However, I hope the patron will take good care of that monster and ensure it does not harm people recklessly. I will do so. Then take it with you. Despite granting permission, Mok Jiangun stared intently at Muzong. At this, Muzong asked in puzzlement. Why are you doing that, patron? Are you not giving me the small restoration pill? Muzong slapped his forehead as if he had forgotten and said. I nearly committed a mistake despite making an agreement. As I age, I sometimes forget things, so I ask for the patron's understanding. Not at all. With those words, Mok Jiangun looked at the surrounding monks. As he brought up the small restoration pill, they had quite regretful expressions. At this, Chong Ryong giggled as if it were amusing. It seems those fellows hoped you would forget, mortal. Indeed. Anyway, you're quite remarkable. In the midst of all this, how did you think to demand the small restoration pill, knowing how the result would turn out? Should I say I learned it? Learned? At Chong Ryong's question, Mok Jiangun smiled faintly. In any case, it was a natural reaction for the monks of Shaolin Temple to be so regretful. Even if it wasn't the great restoration pill, The small restoration pill was also difficult to make. Even the monks of Shaolin, who called this spiritual medicine a treasure, might only get to consume it once in their lifetime, so they couldn't help but feel regretful about it being taken outside. Even for monks who had no material desires, receiving the small restoration pill was an honorable thing. You all go to the Bodhi Hall and bring 5 small restoration pills. At his command, one of the monks asked in puzzlement. Master. Shouldn't 4 pills be enough? Clearly the expelled diakman refused. 1 pill is for that bodhisattva. Muzong's gaze turned towards someone. That someone was none other than the Holy Fire Priestess. At this, Mok Jiangun's eyes gleamed with interest. In fact, since the Holy Fire Priestess was not a martial artist, he had not included her as someone who should separately receive the small restoration pill. However, Muzong had included her as a companion as well. He was truly fair and had great depth. If only half, no 1/3 of the hypocrites in the righteous faction learned from this old monk or Shaolin, there would have been fewer conflicts in the martial arts world. I suppose it's the same for the evil faction or anywhere else. For Mok Jiangun, the righteous faction know all humans were the same. In the end, they were bound to become cunning to achieve what they desired. At that moment, an irritated voice was heard from somewhere. Oh my! How impudent! Turning his head, he saw Precepts Hall Master Daediak expressing his displeasure with an uncomfortable face. The target of his anger was none other than the expelled monk Jiajiam Zhang. The moment Reverse Muscle Scripture Hall Grand Monk Muzong, the highest elder of Shaolin present, acknowledged the defeat of the 108 Arhats formation, he had exclaimed with delight more than anyone else. Ha ha ha. Although he had been expelled, he did not hold a big grudge because of the grace of taking him in, but there was one exception. It was none other than Precepts Hall Master Daediak. From selecting him as one of the 10 precept monks to interfering with and obstructing his every move, it was him. He had even tried to expel him from Shaolin several times by raising issues before he was expelled. If it weren't for his master, Sutra Pavilion Grand Monk Gongjon, it might have already turned out the way Daediak wanted. The expelled monk Jiajiam Zhang snorted at Daediak and said, "What's impudent? Even if you left Shaolin, how can you act so recklessly towards an elder who once taught you no different from an elder? Once I'm out, who's an elder or a venerable? And what's reckless about telling you to keep the agreement? Oh my, this fellow still hasn't changed. Leaving Shaolin has turned you into a ruffian. Yes. No matter what nonsense you spout, this monk will strike you once according to the agreement and leave, so just stand there as agreed. This fellow truly wants to be taught a lesson." With those words, Daediak assumed the stance of the Dragon Blossom Fist. He was ready to strike at Jiajiam Zhang at any moment. Then Sutra Pavilion Grand Monk Gongjon approached, clicked his tongue and spoke. "Amit Ba. Precepts Hall Master. How can you be so stubborn when an agreement was made? This humble monk never agreed to the bet. Ho ho. It's not a pleasant sight. Aren't you the one who demanded that everyone follow the precepts without exception? Yet you're making an exception for yourself." Murmur murmur. At Gongjon's words, even the monks of the commandment hall murmured. Seeing their reaction, Precepts Hall Master Daediak bit his lower lip with a resentful face. Was it what they called tying oneself up with one's own rope? Although he wanted to strike down that impudent expelled monk, if he continued to refuse here, saying he didn't want to be hit, it seemed his dignity would crumble even further. Tich. Thus, Daediak finally released his stance and stepped forward in front of Jiajiam Zhang. Then, glaring at Jiajiam Zhang as if he wanted to kill him, he said, "Fine. Since you want it so badly, strike this humble monk once. Don't think this is the end." Daediak inwardly vowed for the future. He had to let him go for now, but he already had a justification to retrieve the supreme power that had been entrusted to him. Using this as a pretext, he planned to visit him again and properly repay him. But this fellow is too delighted. Daediak clicked his tongue inwardly. Seeing this naive fellow grinning and being so happy just because he could strike him once, it was even absurd. If he resented him so much, he should have asked for an arm instead. What a simple fellow. Daediak, who had been clicking his tongue, finally spoke. "Stop smiling and strike." With those words, Daediak drew up his true energy to protect his body. At this, Gongjon frowned and said, "Precepts Hall Master. You're using true energy to protect your body just to be struck once." "I agree to be struck once, Not that I wouldn't protect my body with true energy. At his sarcastic voice, even the monks coming from the same precepts hall shook their heads. It was to the point where they thought he should cleanly take the hit and end it, considering their past relationship. Meanwhile, the corners of Jia Jianzhong's mouth rose to his ears. Oh. So you're saying it's all right to use true energy? What? Didn't you say so, master? No, that's... You're not saying that you can protect your body with true energy, but this monk should strike with bare fists, right? At Jia Jianzhong's words, Daedioc soon cleared his throat and answered. Ahem. Who said to do that? Do as you wish. As if that will make a difference, you fool. Daedioc inwardly mocked Jia Jianzhong. In any case, he prided himself on having reached the top in internal energy among orthodox martial artists by mastering the bone marrow cleansing scripture and the Mahayana heavenly god technique. Even if he had learned the supreme power, comparing internal strength with himself who had surpassed the wall, was out of the question. Thud. Thud. I'll show you this time. Daedioc stomped his feet strongly on the ground, assuming a horse stance. Seeing his stance, Sutra Pavilion Grand Monk Gongjon sighed. It was the stance of the Vajra indestructible body divine technique. It was a technique that used true energy to transform the entire body's skin to be nearly as strong as Vajra, protecting it. It seemed he had a strong will not to let Jia Jianzhong vent his anger. However, Jia Jianzhong paid no heed to this. Rather, clench. He clenched his fist, then pulled it back and assumed the stance of a mysterious fist technique. Seeing this, the surrounding monks muttered softly. It's the 100 Steps Divine Fist. The 100 Steps Divine Fist. It was one of the 72 unique arts of Shaolin, possessing the power to shatter rocks 100 steps away with fist energy. The 100 Steps Divine Fist was known externally for overcoming distance, but its true advantage lay in the distance getting shorter. The closer the distance, the stronger the power of the 100 Steps Divine Fist becomes. The 100 Steps Divine Fist. I thought he only taught the Vajra demon subduing fist, but he taught him one more unique art. Daedioc glanced at Sutra Pavilion Grand Monk Gongjon, Jia Jianzhong's master, and clicked his tongue. However, it didn't matter. Even if the power of the 100 Steps Divine Fist was ranked among the top 5 fist techniques of Shaolin's 72 unique arts, his internal energy had already surpassed it. Do as you please. As if that will even slightly impa. Whoosh. At that moment. Flinch. Daedioc's eyes wavered. The reason he was so startled was none other than the energy gathering in Jia Jianzhong's fist. He had thought that even if the fellow drew up the power of the 10 Stars realm, it would not be able to impact him. However, whoosh. Energy was ceaselessly gathering in Jia Jianzhong's fist, and the level exceeded his expectations. Yet the energy continued to gather. What in the world was happening? With the fellow's realm, it was impossible for such energy to gather. Amit Ba. Sutra Pavilion Grand Monk Gongjon, who was watching Jia Jianzhong, inwardly chanted a Buddhist prayer. Back when Jia Jianzhong or Diakman was being expelled, he had told him to pretend to have learned the supreme power to prevent his martial arts from being sealed. However, it seemed there was no need for that. If that's not the supreme power, then what is? The surrounding energy was being drawn in. The enlightenment Diakman had attained was truly the supreme power left behind by Bodhidharma during his wall-facing meditation. The energy gathered in Jia Jianzhong's right fist was already approaching that of a master who had surpassed the wall. In a confrontation between masters, there was no time to gather energy, but naturally if there was no time limit like this. Kwang. Wait a moment. The startled Daedioc tried to tell Jia Jianzhong to stop. However, Jia Jianzhong, who had already gathered the greatest energy he could muster in his fist, launched the 100 Steps Divine Fist towards Daedioc's abdomen. Bong. Irk. At that moment, time seemed to flow slowly in Jia Jianzhong's eyes. The instant the fist made contact with the abdomen, Daedioc's eyes widened as if they would pop out, and his face grotesquely contorted. Trickle. Beads of sweat that had sprung up on his forehead flowed down his flushed face. Although he had protected his body with the Vajra indestructible body divine technique, the strike that surpassed it penetrated his abdomen, impacting his internal organs and even his danjian. Thud. Thud. Crack. Along with the sound of the fist power penetrating the abdomen. Bang. Boom. 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 Daedioc's body flew backward, rolling on the ground and bouncing several times before finally stopping at a distance of over a dozen zhang. Ugh. Daedalus, who had barely managed to stand up, staggering, glared at Jia Jiamzhong with bloodshot eyes. Then raising his hand, "Yubas. Bleg." He vomited a mouthful of blood and collapsed face down on the ground. Thud. The mouths of the Shaolin monks watching this scene fell open. They had thought it was unlikely, but who would have imagined that Precepts Hall Master Daedalus, one of the 3 supreme monks of Shaolin, would end up like this from a single punch of the expelled monk? Regardless, Jia Jiamzhong burst into laughter with a wide grin, as if he felt extremely refreshed. Quahahaha. It felt as if a decade's worth of stagnant energy was being released, leaving him feeling too exhilarated. Half an hour later, the demonic beast Humwan, who had managed to take flight despite the wound on his right wing, soared eastward from Shaolin. Someone was quietly watching this scene from the downward slope of Mount Sung. It was none other than Commander Kong Hak. "Do you think I'll let you bastards go just because Shaolin made an agreement? Deputy Commander, go at once and report their route. I will pursue that gigantic monster bird." "Yes, sir." "The warriors of the Guard Bureau and the government troops, follow me." "Yes, sir." With Commander Kong Hak at the lead, the warriors of the Guard Bureau and the government troops pursued him. Due to the demon beast Humwan's injury, his flying speed had slowed down considerably, making it seem possible to catch up to him. As they chased after Humwan, there were people watching them from a higher point halfway up the mountain. They were none other than Mok Jiangun and his companions. Looking at the backs of the government troops chasing after Humwan with all their might, Mok Jiangun smirked and said, "Somehow they really don't deviate from my expectations." Chapter 308, Reunion 1. Looking at the backs of the government troops chasing after the demon beast Humwan with all their might, Mok Jiangun smirked and said, "Somehow they really don't deviate from my expectations." As expected, they were lying in wait. Siep Chun clicked his tongue while looking at the government troops. After reverse muscle scripture Hall Grand Monk Muzong of Shaolin acknowledged the defeat of the 108 Arhats formation, Commander Kong Hak quietly disappeared. He thought that Mok Jiangun and his companions would be too preoccupied with Shaolin to remember him, but that was a miscalculation. As they were in a position to deter the ongoing pursuit of the Imperial troops, they had been carefully watching Commander Kong Hak slip away. Throughout his escape, his expression was filled with schemes, not at all resembling someone who was retreating. "Since the monster bird is heading east, we'll be able to throw off the pursuit for a while," Mong Muyak said as if it was a good thing. If they could avoid the pursuit of the Imperial troops, it could be said that they had accomplished more than 80% of their mission. Meanwhile, the expelled monk Jia Jiamzhong, gulping down liquor from a gourd, asked, "Gulp gulp. Phew. But master, is it alright to send that monster bird away like that? Even if it's difficult for it to carry us due to its injured wing, it seems a bit of a waste to abandon it just for that." He was puzzled because when Shaolin told them to leave it behind, Mok Jiangun had tried his best to take it with them, but now it seemed he was using it as bait to lure the enemies. To this, Mok Jiangun nonchalantly replied, "Don't worry. My spirit beast is connected to me, so even if it's far away it can find its way back. And it seems to need some time to recover its injured wing through magical power. If that's the case, then fine." Jia Jiamzhong spoke as if relieved, rubbing his bald head. Seeing him like that, Siep Chun chuckled and said, "It seems you've grown attached to it." "Ahem. Patch my ass. It's just convenient to ride on." "Hee hee hee. I don't like that laughter." "Who said what?" Leaving the two of them bickering, Mong Muyak pointed to the southwest and said, "For now, my lord, I think we should hurry. Even if they're fooled for the moment, they may soon catch on." "You're right. Now stop being stubborn and ride." Mok Jiangun turned his head and looked at the Holy Fire Priestess. Then the Holy Fire Priestess hurriedly averted her gaze with an awkward expression. Where she averted her gaze, there was the diabolic beast Aliu. Originally, its size was slightly larger than a 2-story building, but as a high-ranking Imi Mangniang, it could adjust its size like Humwan. Now it had become the same size as a horse that could carry a person on its back. All the companions could use lightness skill, but since the Holy Fire Priestess's walking speed was slow due to her old age, they told her to ride Aliu. However, even though its size had been reduced, its appearance was still that of a ferocious monster, so the holy fire priestess kept refusing to ride it. Are you really not going to ride? I'd rather walk. As the holy fire priestess firmly refused, shaking her head, the diabolic beast Aliu, who had been staring at her absent-mindedly, muttered as if annoyed. Tise. What a picky old human. As soon as those words ended, the diabolic beast's red fur changed to a brown color, the horns on its head receded, and its appearance gradually transformed into that of a horse. Ooh. Look at this. This fellow knows how to transform too? Seop Chun and Jiamzhong made a fuss as if they found the diabolic beast Aliu's transformation fascinating. Feeling strangely proud of their reaction, the diabolic beast Ali snorted, cleared its throat and raised its tail. The monster and the people have the same level of thinking. Watching them, Mong Muyak clicked his tongue as if pathetic, crossing his arms. Thanks to the diabolic beast Aliu transforming into the form of a horse, they were able to have the holy fire priestess ride it, and the group hurriedly descended the southwest side of Mount Sung. About 4 days had passed since then. To avoid the pursuit of the imperial troops, the group moved southwest without rest. However, as they entered the northern region of Hubei province, it began to rain, making it difficult to continue moving. In fact, if they pushed through they could have done it, but the problem was, as always, the holy fire priestess. For her, an old woman who had not learned martial arts, the journey thus far had already been physically challenging. This was the case even when the companions took turns infusing her with true energy. Although she was riding a horse, or rather the diabolic beast Aliu, and one might think there would be no reason for her to get tired, even trained riders and cavalry would inevitably strain their hip bones and inner thighs if they rode a horse all day long. The holy fire priestess, whose muscles had deteriorated with age, was in an even more difficult situation, and as it began to rain her body temperature dropped, making her even more vulnerable. Ha. I feel dizzy. It seems it would be too much to continue. Seop Chun checked the holy fire priestess's pulse to examine her condition and said. At this, Mong Muyak looked around and said, My lord, since it has come to this, how about resting for a while at our association's branch nearby? It should be not too far from here. Branch. Yes, according to the original plan, there is a midway point we need to stop by for reporting. We were going to head there directly as we had to move west towards Sichuan, but it seems difficult due to the rain. Rather than taking a slightly longer route, it would be better to stop by the branch, rest and receive a carriage. A carriage. Looking at the holy fire priestess, whose lips had turned blue and was shivering, Mok Jun nodded. It seemed she had truly reached her limit. Thus, they traveled south for about half a day, and before long, they arrived at a small village of about 30 households where the branch of the Heaven and Earth Society was located. Mong Muyak, the only one who knew about the branch, pointed to a few dilapidated houses on the west side of the village with his finger. It's over there. How unexpected. Yes, the northern part of Hubei province is close to the righteous faction's territory, so I heard they tried to make it as close to the civilian houses as possible. I see. Let's go for now. If they didn't escape the rain quickly, the shivering holy fire priestess seemed like she would collapse. Contrary to its shabby exterior, the interior of the branch was clean and quite cozy. Elder, I brought you some tea. Please drink it. Thank you. The holy fire priestess, who was sitting in front of the firewood in the brazier, received the teacup as if she would survive. If it weren't for the companions taking turns infusing her with true energy, she might have already died of hypothermia. Although she was basking in the warmth, she was still shivering with a pale face, indicating that the cold had not subsided yet. Seeing this, Mong Muyak said, It seems we need to rest for about half a day. You're right. I hope the rain subsides a bit during that time, but... Rumble. Judging by the continuous thunder and even lightning, it seemed unlikely. In any case, they said it would take more than half a day to fetch a carriage, so it was better to rest properly. Meanwhile, the middle-aged branch leader cautiously asked them, The meal will be ready soon, but is there anything else you need? In response to that question, the expelled monk Jiamzhong answered as if he had been waiting. My throat is dry, so I need to drink some warm liquor. Ah, then I'll warm up some white liquor and... White liquor? Don't you have anything else? I happen to have rice wine brought from Jiangnan. I'll warm it up and bring it to you. Ah, good. For Jia Jiamzhong, who had started drinking to cope with the agony of seeing things he shouldn't have seen, at some point he could no longer live without alcohol. As the branch leader left, Mok Jiangun, as if remembering something, "It's a good timing." He took out a pouch from his bosom. Seeing the pouch, everyone's gaze turned towards it. That was because inside that pouch were the spiritual medicine small restoration pills given by Shaolin Temple. Mok Jiangun had received them all at once, and since they had to urgently move to avoid pursuit, everyone had momentarily forgotten about them. Small restoration pill. I wonder if it's true that there is absolutely no loss of true energy when circulating it, unlike all other spiritual medicines. There were quite a few famous spiritual medicines besides the small restoration pill. For example, there was the purple essence pill of the Huashan sect and the great clarity pill of the Wudang sect. However, the reason why Shaolin's spiritual medicine was particularly famous was that there was no loss of true energy compared to others. Loss referred to the energy that dispersed during the process of absorbing the spiritual medicine. Usually, no matter how excellent a spiritual medicine was, it was very rare to be able to absorb it close to 100%. However, Shaolin's small restoration pill and great restoration pill boasted an absorption rate close to 100% regardless of one's constitution or aptitude. That was why they were called the supreme spiritual medicines. Gulp. Siep Chun licked his lips while looking at the pouch of spiritual medicine. He wanted to ask for one pill, thinking it was an individual reward, but since it was something the Lord had obtained regardless of the reason, he was hesitant to ask for it recklessly. The others felt the same way. Meanwhile, Mok Jiangun took out 5 small restoration pills from the pouch. Then he said, "I'll give you one each, so take this opportunity to consume it and circulate your energy." "And my lord." As soon as those words were spoken, Siep Chun knelt before Mok Jiangun as if he was moved. From his perspective, he had inwardly thought that Mok Jiangun, his lord, might not give them the small restoration pills out of greed, so he couldn't help but be delighted. "I will serve you with unwavering loyalty." "Weren't you doing that already?" How could that be?" "I have always been prepared to give my life for you." At Siep Chun's flustered response, Mok Jiangun chuckled and tossed him a small restoration pill. Tap. Siep Chun received it as preciously as a sacred object. Next, Mong Muyak. Tap. "Thank you, my lord." Although Mong Muyak was a man of few words, the corners of his mouth rose after receiving the small restoration pill, indicating his good mood. He had suffered a lot since pledging his loyalty to Mok Jiangun, and it felt like he was finally being rewarded. After giving Mong Muyak a small restoration pill, Mok Jiangun called the next person. "Ma Are Hyan." "Yes, my lord." "Take it." Tap. Ma Are Hyan caught the small restoration pill tossed by Mok Jiangun. Ma Are Hyan's eyes gleamed with surprise. Unlike the other two, he had become a subordinate not long ago, and he thought that Mok Jiangun might not trust him due to the incident with the Holy Fire Priestess, so he had considered the possibility of not receiving a small restoration pill. However, seeing him readily hand over this treasure, which was no different from a treasure to a martial artist, without any hesitation, he felt a strange feeling. Even if he absorbed them all himself, no one would be able to complain. Truly an unpredictable person. Does he generously bestow upon those he considers his people? While he was thinking that, Mok Jiangun held one of the 2 remaining pills and called out to the expelled monk Jia Jiamzhong. Jia Jiamzhong. At this, everyone was puzzled. He had refused the small restoration pill with his own mouth and chosen to strike Precepts Hall Master Dadiok, one of the 3 supreme monks of Shaolin, once. Was he really going to give his share to someone like that? Mok Jiangun was really about to toss a small restoration pill to Jia Jiamzhong. Then Jia Jiamzhong hurriedly waved his hand. "This monk doesn't need it." "You don't need it?" "While it may be necessary for those who need to fill their vessel, what this monk needs is enlightenment, master." At those words, Siep Chun spoke in a tone of incomprehension. "What? Are you refusing the Lord's favor? Don't regret it later and just take it." I said I don't need it." "How can you at such a good opportunity?" At that moment, Mok Jiangun chuckled and said, "No, Jia Jiamzhong is right. This spiritual medicine is indeed meaningless to him." At those words, Siep Chun tilted his head. He didn't understand, but Mok Jiangun knew that Jia Jiamzhong had comprehended the supreme energy circulation technique that allowed him to draw in the surrounding energy at any time, so he did not insist further. The spiritual medicine was of no significance to him. Then Mok Jang-un, holding the small restoration pill, looked at the Holy Fire Priestess. The Holy Fire Priestess, who had been basking in the firewood of the brazier, saw it and shook her head, saying, "From what I see, that spiritual medicine seems to be more useful for you who have learned martial arts. There's no need to give it to this old man." Due to her refusal, 2 small restoration pills remained in Mok Jang-un's hand. At this, Seop Chun said to Mok Jang-un, "My lord, the spiritual medicine you obtained. Please consume both pills." Seop Chun is right. "My lord, please consume them all." Mong Muyak also supported his words. The stronger Mok Jang-un whom they served as their lord became, the more beneficial it would be for them, and there was nothing bad about it. However, Mok Jang-un suddenly looked at them and, tap, tap. He abruptly tossed the remaining small restoration pills, 1 each, to them. Seop Chun and Mong Muyak, who received them in a daze, spoke with a dumbfounded expression. "My lord, why? Why are you giving us this? I don't need them. My lord, I understand that your martial arts have advanced, but 2 small restoration pills can grant 20 years' worth of internal energy. How can you give up such an opportunity?" "It's all right. Rather, it seems you 2 need them the most." "How so?" "I want you to become more useful." At Mok Jang-un's words, Seop Chun and Mong Muyak's eyes trembled. The words about becoming more useful didn't even register in their ears. They had been grateful and satisfied just by receiving 1 small restoration pill. However, not only that, but when he handed over 2 small restoration pills, which were no different from his own share, to them, they couldn't help but be truly moved. "My lord truly cherishes us sincerely. No matter how much of a subordinate one is, how many people could give up such a treasure? Despite being younger than us, his magnanimity is truly great." It wasn't just them who were surprised by this. Ma Are Hyan and Jia Jiamjong also began to view Mok Jang-un in a different light, seeing him distribute the remaining spiritual medicine to his subordinates without a moment's hesitation. Most of them had become followers of Mok Jang-un regardless of their own will, so they had been vigilant about being used and possibly abandoned at any time. However, from the incident at Shaolin where he tried to protect even a mere monster to him generously distributing the precious spiritual medicine, their perception of him gradually changed. As their gazes toward Mok Jang-un became even more favorable, Chong Ryong chuckled and said, "Was it intentional? Would you believe me if I said it was pure goodwill? As if you would do such a thing." At her words, Mok Jang-un shrugged his shoulders. Whether it was a whim or not, goodwill was not something that suited Mok Jang-un. "Anyway, you gave them something you didn't even need and increased their loyalty, so you got quite a good deal out of it." For Mok Jang-un, who relied on the energy of death, the spiritual medicine of Shaolin that boosted the true energy of nourishing life held no meaning. Therefore, he had simply utilized the useless spiritual medicine appropriately. The more useful cards, the better. At Mok Jang-un's words, Chong Ryong felt inwardly pleased. Is this fellow mortal aware of his own changes? Compared to her, a vengeful spirit, mortal's weakness was his particularly lacking relationship with others because he didn't believe in humans. However, he was gradually becoming skilled at forming relationships and leading a group. Revenge might still be his priority, but this was clearly a positive change. Gasp. Suddenly, Chong Ryong froze. What was that just now? An unknown emotion surged beyond the satisfaction of his change. Such an unfamiliar emotion was something she had only felt when she was alive.